Right, we're back recording. So, as I said previously, we're going to look at some of the other weapons that could have been used as parrying devices in the period, and some of them were. The first of which is the knife. This is a, training bowie, because long kind of bowie-ish knives kind of came into their own in the 19th century. But because black things just don't show up on camera very well, I'm going to use a medieval training rondel dagger. But if it makes you feel any better, this is kind of similar to a Highland dirk, which there are records of Highlanders using their dirks as parrying devices in pretty much the same way. It's also similar. There were naval dirks during the period, like these long, pointy, jabby knives, and other weapons that just other sort of knives that are similar enough to this that it's useful as a simulator. But the idea with the knife is basically the same as with the pistol. I hold it tip down, and I basically put it in front of my forearm and create a parrying surface. So I'm sitting here. The guard is exactly the same, fairly not horizontal, but upper arm to keep my forearm is fairly forward to keep it in front of me. I'm covering primarily the high inside line, and then my sword is doing its thing down here. So I'm coming from like a tierce guard, from the guard normally feds from. Same kind of idea with the pistol, where I'm just saying to my opponent, you can't attack this line, or alternatively, you can attack my forearm. Oh, whoops, that was a ruse. Or alternatively, and something I find that's really good, I found doing sword and bowie, is I actually sit it down quite low, like even on my hip, or alternatively, like just in front of my arm, and as a way of baiting, because from here, if I'm doing my job controlling distance, like just constantly flicking out, harassing attacks to keep my opponent at bay, basically, if you've ever done boxing, think of it as the equivalent of a jab, or same jab in like the jab, or like a front leg kick in mixed martial arts, or a front leg kick in a lot of different kickboxing forms. I'm throwing quick attacks to keep my opponent at bay. If I keep doing that, the only way they can go for my leg is with a big committed leg dive, which I can deal with by slipping and countercutting. And so anything that comes in is going to come in somewhere here. I'm in a guard that covers my high outside. My opponent is going to come in somewhere here, and so long as I pick my moment right, I can do basically the same thing that we did with the pistol, where I come up and throw an attack. And I come up, I parry as I come in with my own attack, and I can even use my dagger to really displace my opponent. The other thing I can do, which with the weapon held this way, is I don't have to do a wide lunge, or even a very direct lunge. Like if I want to lunge in directly, I can rely more on my parrying device, with dagger or pistol, to displace my opponent. So their sword is over here somewhere, and I'm coming in and launching attack, hopefully an open line. The other thing I can do is just parry and have a crack at their arm. So my opponent comes in, I'm holding my knife fairly low. My opponent comes in with a sword. I'm hitting it laterally, I'm moving it. I want to move it to over here, so that I've then got a direct attack to their arm. And this is this isn't quite a simultaneous movement. I don't want to do this because my opponent's sword might not be out of the way. I want to start my sword moving when my dagger is about halfway. So or even just, my dagger gets up to about here and then goes, just to maximize the chance of me clearing my opponent's sword with this. This is a very high risk move, but if you pull it off, it's pretty sweet. So motion is parry and counter, 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 and parry and counter. So that's, I mean, I know that's something I've come up with, although the motions do come from other period martial arts. For those of you who were here last week when we talked about boxing, in 19th century boxing, you parry and counter. So this is just me taking movements from one period martial art and applying them to another, which is also a thing that is very well documented in the period. When Andre talks about how to fence with a knife, he says the guard is like a boxing guard, except the hand, except the hand is more like a fencing guard, or he says the hand. He says, but except that the hands are slightly more extended and in this position rather than being like this. When Hutton talks about how to use a knife, Hutton doesn't actually tell you what the knife cuts are. He just says cut number 1, 2, 3. But it's fairly obvious that he's just using the same cuts as he does for saber. People use the exact same movements that they used for other weapons with different, or they use for one weapon with another. I mean, you see this a lot. Actually, I mean, like you see this with Hutton quite a bit, where, his medium guard is his foil guard, his primary saber guard, his primary knife guard. Pretty much, he even uses it a little bit in his historical stuff, although most of his historical guards are with period weapons. But he's using the same movements and positions because that's his movement vocabulary, and that's just kind of how people roll. Incidentally, if you see martial arts saying, oh yeah, it's designed to use all the same movements for seamless integration, it's not designed like that. It's just what people do, is they will move the same way unless they have a good reason to move differently, because that's just people's movement vocabulary. All right, so the other thing that I can do with a knife that's kind of cool, and this is something I can only do with a knife, not something I can do with a pistol, is I can parry and then stab. So I can actually close with my opponent. So my recommendation, if you're going to do this, if you're not also using your sword for extra coverage, your sword is probably somewhere so far away that it can't come in. But just as an opening move, parry, see how I'm basically cutting lines as I come in. And remember, as a cut because a cut comes in an arc, the tip is going to be higher the further back it is. So, if my opponent was here, they'd be closer to me than if my opponent was here, where my sword is more extended. So I want to cover high. If I know my opponent's coming with a high cut, particularly if they've come, particularly if my opponent is coming out of a high guard at me, I can, although it's very risky, parry and then stab. And in this case, it's okay to pass. So I'll show you that from the side. Parry, stab. When you're doing this for realsies, you can get a bit of a run up. So I bounce, and I want to try and accelerate as much as I can. Be very careful doing this in sparring. Make sure that you're using a very flexible knife, or alternatively, like tap your opponent with the blade, because we don't want accidents. But when you're doing this, stab. Parry, stab. Parry, stab. Parry, stab. Parry, stab. And once more for luck, parry, stab. Incidentally, the way I learned about that was I was experimenting with sword and dagger with a class, and previous experiences with sword and dagger had demonstrated to me and other people that, with different clubs, that the dagger mostly just stopped grappling from happening and would occasionally be used as a parrying device, unless it was like a big kind of proper parrying dagger, in which case it would always be used as a parrying device. And we're like, oh yeah, so a sword and dagger, or sword and knife, like sword with, a knife like this, is basically just single sword, except with less closing because everyone's a bit nervous, and the occasional weird dagger stuff. And then I did it with a different group, had a very different mentality, which consisted of, hey, how do we get the dagger to work? And that's where this movement comes from, because the first person to get it to work, it's one of my students, it was either Mish or William. Mish or William, if you're watching this, please tell me who did. But from basically this position, against a riposte, so a more predictable cut than an opening cut, they came in and just basically charged and stabbed. And it was amazing because as far as they were concerned, the whole point of the night was to get the dagger to work. And we discovered all this cool dagger stuff, like offensive dagger stuff that I previously had thought was really a thing. Turns out, you know, if you're committed to stabbing someone with a dagger, you'll find ways to stabbing someone with a dagger. All right, so that's kind of the utility of this kind of dagger. Before we move on and I talk about a different type of dagger, are there any questions? Any questions? I'm kind of curious about, like, 'cause I know offhand dagger happened a bit in the 18th century. Interesting enough, the main point of reference for offhand dagger use was also in North America, amongst like frontiersmen and stuff who would fight with knife and tomahawk. They'd use their dagger in the offhand apparently. I don't know a lot about North American folk martial arts. So, you know, if there's someone out there who knows more than me, feel free to just correct me. But yeah, the same idea where the dagger is here as a parrying device. And the idea was that, you know, when you're fighting, you'd try and use your dagger to either hook or block your opponent's axe so that you could then come in and hope that they don't hook or block yours or just run in and stab you. But yeah, like my experience with sword and dagger consisted of, well, not sword and dagger, with axe and dagger, sorry, consisted of me fighting a friend of mine who was using a broadsword with a dagger I had made and an axe I'd recently acquired, and discovering that the fact that he had like his weapons like twice as long as mine made it my life very, very difficult, because I basically had to rely on a high risk parry to get in. Although it's probably for the best, because in hindsight, the knife that I'd made, the homemade knife, training knife, like supposedly blunt knife, was not flexible enough to really be safe. So I'm kind of glad that he destroyed me in that engagement, because, you know, it's better to, you know, better to lose and be unharmed than to, you know, win and accidentally hurt one of your friends. Yeah, so it's looking like there's no questions, so I might just pause recording before we move on.